Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They tell us the Ultramarines are the golden sons of the Imperium, paragons of honor, discipline, and martial perfection. But that is a mask. A myth forged by millennia of propaganda, the burnished reflection of a truth too complex, too scarred, to fit within the narrow confines of hero worship. The Ultramarines have been polished into icons, made into the face of the Adeptus Astartes, their flaws smoothed over, their tragedies muted beneath the roar of thunderous victories and gleaming ceramite. But for those willing to peer beneath the surface, to dig beneath the codex and the laurels, a different story emerges. One that is not only more interesting, but far more human. This is a legion born in shadows as much as light. A primarch who built an empire with cold steel and colder logic, an ideology of order that sometimes crushed the very spirit it claimed to protect. This is not the story of flawless warriors. It is the story of a legion scarred by loss, guilt, and impossible expectations. A tale of brothers who became administrators, of warriors turned into myth, of a legacy shaped not just by what was done, but by what was buried, denied, forgotten. This is the whole truth about the Ultramarines. Everything you didn't know, and everything you were never meant to. Macragge was never a paradise, not before Roboute Guilliman, not during his reign, and certainly not after. It was a world built on iron, sweat, and blood, a planet whose people valued order not as a virtue but as a necessity for survival. Unlike the feral death worlds or pleasure planets that birthed other primarchs, Macragge was a world of rigid stratification and merciless ambition. Its terrain was unforgiving, its politics cruel, and its culture a machine that demanded obedience above all else. The very soil of Macragge grew no fruit unless it was tilled with discipline and sacrifice. And in that crucible, Guilliman did not learn compassion. He learned control. The early Ultramarines were not molded by nobility, but by the quiet, ever-present brutality of a system that prized law over love. When Guilliman was discovered and adopted by the patrician Conor Guilliman, he quickly began reshaping the region's governance with such ruthless efficiency that it terrified even the most hardened administrators. Bandits, criminals, and political dissidents vanished into work camps or were executed with cold indifference. The young primarch was not cruel in the manner of Angron or Kurz. His cruelty came not from sadism, but from unshakable certainty. He believed so completely in his own vision of order that deviation was not just inefficient. It was treasonous. From the beginning, the legion that would become the Ultramarines absorbed this ethos like a sponge. Recruits from Macragge were not taught to be brothers first. They were taught to be servants of the state. Their camaraderie was forged in shared loyalty to the mission, not to each other. They saluted before they embraced. This subtle but profound difference in orientation set them apart from legions like the Luna Wolves or the Salamanders. Even before the Codex Astartes was written, the bones of bureaucracy had already grown inside them. They were soldiers, yes, but more importantly, they were instruments of Guilliman's vision. This vision, of course, expanded. When Guilliman was reunited with the Emperor, he did not just take command of the 13th Legion. He brought with him an entire planetary system reorganized under his efficient, unyielding ideals. Macragge became the heart of Ultramar, a constellation of worlds ruled not by faith or zeal, but by procedure and protocol. It was an empire in miniature, a simulation of what the wider Imperium could become if it were only stripped of its madness and reduced to columns, ledgers, and policies. But that dream came at a cost. Beneath the smooth marble of Macragge's monuments were the skeletons of the poor, the silenced, and the discarded. The beauty of Ultramar was built on the backs of those who dared not question Guilliman's order. The rebellious were branded anarchists. The inefficient were re-educated. Every world brought into compliance became another node in a vast, cold engine. The Legion did not question these methods. They had been raised to see order as salvation, even if it meant cracking bones to achieve it. The tragedy is that Macragge believed itself to be better. While other legions gloried in war or burned with zealotry, the Ultramarines told themselves they were above such savagery. But there is savagery in silence too. There is a violence in bureaucracy that cannot be measured in blood alone. The people of Macragge learned to suppress dissent, to worship the gears of empire. And the Ultramarines became not liberators, but enforcers of a peace bought with fear. Even their triumphs reeked of control. When the Ultramarines brought a world into the fold, they did not simply conquer it. They reorganized it, audited it, absorbed it into the unfeeling anatomy of the Ultramar realm. Planets were renamed, histories were rewritten, local traditions were excised if they conflicted with the doctrine of compliance. This was not a melting pot, it was assimilation. A cultural sterilization dressed in the armor of civilization. And yet, to many in the Imperium, Macragge remained a beacon. To administratum officials and imperial governors, Ultramar was proof that the Imperium could function without constant warfare or religious insanity. They did not see the coldness, only the order. They did not feel the subtle suffocation, only the relief of a system that worked. The Ultramarines became the shining example, the gold standard of Astartes behavior, not because they were better, but because they were easier to control, easier to understand, easier to replicate. In truth, the world that made them was not a shining bastion of human greatness. It was a warning, a reminder that even in the Emperor's light, one can build a tyranny of law just as easily as one of fire. The tragedy of Macragge is not that it failed, it is that it succeeded exactly as intended. Roboute Guilliman is often painted in shimmering tones, the perfect general, the tireless administrator, the only primarch who truly understood how to govern. But this is a surface truth, the kind that gleams with propaganda and fails to reveal the dark veins running underneath. Guilliman was not merely a commander of warriors, he was a bureaucrat of war, a strategist of the soul, and a builder of empires whose precision often veiled a profound absence of empathy. His genius was real, but so was his detachment. And in that detachment, one finds a man who was less a father to his sons and more an architect of mechanisms that just so happened to bleed. He saw war as a matter of logistics, where Horus inspired loyalty with charisma and Sanguinius with divinity, Guilliman inspired with predictability. He moved like a machine of flesh and intellect, parsing planetary resources, estimating mortality rates, pre-allocating reinforcements before a battle had even begun. This was not callousness in the traditional sense. He did not glory in bloodshed, but it was a kind of clinical disregard. He viewed human lives as factors in a ledger, variables in a celestial equation. For Guilliman, grief was wasteful, mourning, a distraction. Every emotion not immediately useful to victory was discarded like defective armor. The Ultramarines did not love their primarch the way other legions loved theirs. They revered him, certainly, respected him beyond question. But there was always a distance, a gap so wide it could never be bridged by shared hardship or mutual admiration. Guilliman's sons were cogs, perfectly crafted and meticulously arranged. And like cogs, they were replaceable. When one failed, another would be slotted in. The engine never paused. This was not born from malice. Guilliman believed in humanity, but not the chaotic, weeping, imperfect humanity that bleeds in the gutters of hive cities or writes poetry to lost gods. He believed in humanity as a system, a civilization of ordered layers and functions, each fulfilling its prescribed role. His love was not for individuals, but for the idea of a species that could survive through adherence to rules. He did not weep for his fallen sons, because the loss of one soldier did not outweigh the necessity of the machine. In council, he could be cold to the point of inhuman. His fellow primarchs often clashed with his rigid views. Angron despised his control. Kurz mocked his ethics. Russ viewed his laws as chains. Even Rogel Dorn, himself a creature of fortresses and calculation, found Guilliman's endless codification wearying. Only Ferrus Manus approached Guilliman's systemic vision, and even then, Ferrus burned with passion where Guilliman merely plotted. The irony is cruel. Guilliman saw emotion as weakness, yet it was the very thing that made his brothers human. During the Great Crusade, Guilliman's approach often alienated the worlds he sought to bring into compliance. Where other legions offered fire or faith, the Ultramarines offered forms, tribunals, occupational restructurings. Planets were not merely conquered, they were annexed into a spreadsheet of galactic governance. Guilliman's brilliance in administration made him a darling of the Emperor's bureaucratic machinery, but it also cast him as a cold conqueror to those who had once dreamed of freedom beneath the stars. His flaws became even more apparent during the Horus heresy. While the Imperium fractured in fire and betrayal, Guilliman withdrew, not out of cowardice, but out of need to calculate. He did not rush headlong into the flames like Vulcan or Russ. He began building a contingency, Imperium Secundus, not out of hope, but grim inevitability. He assumed the Emperor was dead, and in that assumption, he moved with brutal efficiency to preserve what could be saved, regardless of the cost. It was an act of genius, yes, but also of pessimism. Guilliman did not dream of victory. He prepared for survival. The bitterness of his post-heresy years, when he became de facto ruler of the shattered Imperium, only deepened this isolation. He worked without pause, without sleep, without joy. The burden of rebuilding was one only he could bear, and it transformed him into something less than a man and more than a machine. The Codex Astartes, his grand legacy, was a document of control, a way to ensure that never again would one man wield the power of 10,000. But it was also a confession, a silent admission that he did not trust his brothers, that he did not trust himself. There is a tragedy here. Guilliman was not heartless, but he had long since buried his heart beneath layers of efficiency, regulation, and expectation. He loved his legion, but he could not show it. He desired peace, but he only knew how to build engines of war. He longed for connection, but every part of his being had been forged in the belief that only control could save mankind. And so he built empires. He wrote codes. He measured souls and compliance rates and mortality curves. Robout Guilliman was not the noblest of the primarchs. He was the most necessary, the one who did not inspire with fire or beauty, but with a cold resolve to outlast the darkness. A bureaucrat of war, a general of the mind, and a god of silence. The Codex Astartes is often revered as scripture, a perfect artifact of martial wisdom, codified by the most disciplined of the Emperor's sons. To many across the Imperium, it is the cornerstone of stability, the blueprint that saved the Adeptus Astartes from extinction after the horrors of the Horus Heresy. But beneath its tactical brilliance and structural clarity lies a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The Codex is not merely a tool of order. It is also a tool of control. Not just a guide to war, but a chain around the throat of every chapter, forged by the fears and regrets of a single primarch. Guilliman did not write the Codex Astartes from a place of triumph. He wrote it from despair. In the smoldering ruins of the Imperium, surrounded by the ashes of brotherhood and the broken remains of once glorious legions, he sought to ensure that no Astartes would ever again possess the power to tear the galaxy in half. The Codex was a reaction, a reflexive, almost panicked attempt to reassert control over a species that had proved it could not be trusted with unity. It was his answer to Horus, to betrayal, to the pain of losing kin, to madness. And so, the legions were shattered. 10,000 warriors reduced to 1,000. Vast organizations dismantled. Traditions erased. Names changed. Colors repainted. The great legions, each a unique reflection of their primarch's soul, were now mere chapters, standardized and sterilized. This was not evolution. It was dissection. To Guilliman, this was a necessary surgery, but to others, it felt like castration. Vulcan wept. Russ howled. Dorn refused until blood was spilled. Even loyal sons saw the Codex as an act of cowardice, a betrayal of what they had fought for. Guilliman argued that it was for the good of all, that structure would prevent future heresy. But many saw it as a rejection of identity, a denial of passion, a sacrifice of spirit for the sake of predictability. The Codex did not simply regulate tactics, it regulated everything. Company sizes, armor markings, command hierarchies, colors, symbols, rites, rituals, reserve allocations, fleet dispersal, even the correct invocation protocols before battle. It turned the Astartes into parts of a greater bureaucracy, removing their last ties to legion loyalty or primarchal heritage. To the Administratum, this was perfect, a tool they could understand, audit, and control. But to the Astartes themselves, it was a cage lined with gold. Of course, the Codex was brilliant in many ways. It provided unparalleled flexibility in combat. It allowed for rapid response, strategic redeployment, and minimized the risk of catastrophic loss. It taught discipline, reinforced doctrine, and preserved a fragile stability in an Imperium threatened by 1,000 knives. But even brilliance can come with a price. In enforcing uniformity, the Codex stripped away the soul of what made each legion unique. The warrior poets of the Blood Angels, the storm hunters of the Space Wolves, the ghost brothers of the Raven Guard, all were now forced to measure themselves by a standard they never asked for. And yet, compliance became loyalty. Chapters that deviated were labeled unorthodox or at risk. Those who clung to their roots were seen with suspicion. Over time, the Codex ceased being a guideline and became dogma, a text to be quoted, not questioned. In the halls of the ecclesiarchy, it was even treated as scripture, an ironic fate for a document born from atheistic pragmatism. The true horror is that Guilliman's Codex worked. It preserved the Astartes, at least on the surface. It made the High Lords feel safe. It gave the people of the Imperium an image of unity. But in doing so, it hollowed out the brotherhoods that had once bled for the throne. The Codex turned warriors into departments, heroes into roles, legacies into numbers. Some chapters, like the Ultramarines themselves, embraced it fully. To them, the Codex is a living doctrine, a perfect fusion of philosophy and military science. They revere Guilliman not only as their primarch, but as their prophet. Others, like the Black Templars, reject it openly. They see the Codex as a leash and Guilliman as a well-meaning jailer. Between these extremes lie 1,000 compromises. Chapters that follow the Codex in part, that interpret its meanings, that apply its rules selectively. And in that variance, the cracks begin to show. Because the Codex cannot prepare a warrior for madness. It cannot restore a brother lost to the warp. It cannot explain the soul of a legion or the echo of a primarch's laughter. It cannot fill the void left by kin who will never return. Guilliman sought to prevent another heresy. What he created was something safer, but also something sadder. The Codex Astartes is a marvel of strategy, a monument to reason, and a mausoleum for the things that made the legions more than armies. It keeps the Astartes alive. But at what cost? The phrase compliance echoes through the annals of the Great Crusade like a sterile mantra. It sounds benign, almost clinical, a process by which worlds were peacefully integrated into the Imperium's fold. But beneath the veneer of diplomacy and reconstruction lies a legacy of horror, especially when wielded by the 13th Legion. The Ultramarines, those paragons of civilization and discipline, were also enforcers of Guilliman's vision. And when that vision met resistance, it was not negotiations that followed, it was annihilation. Dark compliance is a term whispered among imperial scholars who dare to peel back the layers of sanctioned history. It refers to those worlds that did not simply fall into line, that resisted the boot of order, that dared to value their autonomy, their cultures, their ways of life. When such defiance met Guilliman's legion, the response was not fury, it was procedure, and in many ways, that was far more terrifying. Unlike the Night Lords, who reveled in fear, or the World Eaters, who drowned planets in blood, the Ultramarines brought a colder doom. They would arrive in orbit, conduct assessments, and begin targeted strikes with surgical precision. Infrastructure was disabled, leadership quietly removed, and populations corralled into compliance zones. Propaganda networks were established even as monuments were torn down and replaced with statues of imperial unity. In weeks, entire civilizations were gutted, not with fire, but with forms. Not with rage, but with silence. These campaigns were seldom recorded in detail. The Ultramarines did not boast of their darker acts. There are no tales of planetary decapitations, no legends sung of resistance crushed under bolter and blade. But the silence speaks volumes. Entire systems have vanished from official maps. Cultures erased so thoroughly that only the empty names remain in astropathic records. This was not war. This was euthanasia of dissent. The most chilling aspect is how calm the Ultramarines were in these operations. There was no moral anguish, no visible discomfort. To them, resistance was not a moral dilemma, it was a statistical anomaly. Non-compliant worlds were not evil, they were inefficient, and inefficiency in Guilliman's galaxy was a sin punishable by erasure. In one infamous instance, a planet Heratovis refused to dismantle its theocratic caste system. Guilliman's envoys offered reform. The planet's leaders countered with demands for independence. Within a month, Heratovis had no leaders. Within 2, it had no temples. Within a year, it had no history. The entire culture was absorbed into Ultramar's records, stripped of identity, repurposed into a model imperial province. Its language was banned, its symbols outlawed, its sacred texts burned or rewritten into compliance catechisms. The irony is cruel. The Ultramarines saw themselves as civilizers. They believed, truly believed, that they were saving these worlds from chaos. And in a sense, they were. Chaos is not only the domain of demons and heretics, it is also the messiness of choice, of difference, of contradiction. Guilliman's order left no room for such chaos. He demanded that mankind be one voice, one purpose, one destiny. And where that unity could not be encouraged, it would be enforced. Gently if possible, brutally if necessary. Many of the Ultramarines themselves did not see this as atrocity. Their upbringing on Macragge had conditioned them to view obedience as virtue. They did not question orders because their entire reality was structured around compliance. They were not taught to debate morality. They were taught to execute missions with efficiency. And when the mission was to restructure a society, they carried it out with the same calm professionalism they would apply to destroying a Xeno's stronghold. Even after the heresy, when the Imperium reeled from the treachery of the War Master, these memories were not condemned. They were buried. Guilliman never apologized. He never looked back. The atrocities committed in the name of order were justified by the stability they brought. And in truth, many within the Imperium were grateful. They saw the Ultramarines as saviors, not because they were gentle, but because they were effective. Peace, even if born in silence and pain, was preferable to the anarchy of the stars. But the ghosts remain, not in the open histories, but in the scars left on the stars. There are whispers of ancient rebellions, of lost cities buried beneath standard-issue imperial structures, of strange songs sung in dead languages by those too old to forget. These are the remnants of Guilliman's dark compliance, the broken notes of cultures smothered by the weight of order. The tragedy is not that the Ultramarines committed atrocities. Many legions did. The tragedy is that they did so with such calm, such reason, such unshakable belief in the rightness of their cause. They did not burn with hatred. They did not scream with rage. They came with forms, with plans, with architects and administrators. They came to build, and in that building they buried so many truths. Calth was supposed to be a jewel, a shining testament to the promise of Ultramar, a world of learning, industry, and light. Its skies were blue, its cities orderly, and its people loyal. It embodied everything the Ultramarines claimed to represent: discipline, progress, harmony. And then it burned. Betrayed by those they called brothers, the 13 Legion watched as the word-bearers turned that promise into ash, unleashing demons beneath the crust and turning the planet's surface into a poisoned grave. What happened on Calth was more than a battle. It was a spiritual decapitation, a psychic wound that never healed. The word-bearers did not simply attack. They defiled. They desecrated the very principles that the Ultramarines built their empire upon. They didn't come for conquest, they came for vengeance. Lorgar's sons had waited in silence, stoking the fires of hatred after being humiliated by Guilliman for their so-called heretical worship. The Edict of Nicaea may have silenced their tongues, but not their fury. And on Calth, they spoke with bolters and demons, with blade and warp. The betrayal struck with surgical cruelty. The Ultramarines had no time to prepare. Their fleets were sabotaged, their communication lines severed, their supply chains collapsed. What was meant to be a joint muster for the Great Crusade turned into a bloodbath of fratricide. Entire regiments were gunned down while at parade rest. Transport ships exploded mid-air. Hospitals became morgues in hours. There was no honor in this war, only a calculated, ritualistic massacre. And yet, the Ultramarines did not break. They bled, they screamed, but they did not shatter. Forced into subterranean combat beneath the irradiated surface, they waged a grinding war of attrition against an enemy possessed not only by hatred, but by the warp itself. For many Ultramarines, this was their first true encounter with chaos. And it was not just horrifying, it was unthinkable. The universe, which they had tried so hard to organize, suddenly cracked open, revealing a void of screaming madness. The psychological damage was immense. The Ultramarines, once secure in their righteousness, were forced to reckon with the idea that their structure, their codex, their order, none of it could shield them from treachery. That discipline was not a bulwark against chaos, but a brittle illusion. On Calth, faith and brotherhood died. Trust was dismembered alongside the bodies of fallen comrades, and somewhere deep in that radioactive labyrinth, something colder was born. resolve without warmth, obedience without love. After Calth, the Ultramarines changed. Not on the surface, to outsiders, they remained the perfect Astartes. But beneath their armor, behind their eyes, something vital had been lost. Calth taught them that order alone is not enough, that even the most perfect of systems can be shattered by lies. And rather than turn to vengeance or despair, they turned inward. They redoubled their belief in the Codex. Not because it would save them, but because it was all they had left. Guilliman himself emerged from Calth marked by rage, a fury so cold it nearly drove him to crush his remaining brothers in suspicion. His writings from that period are sharper, more dogmatic, less forgiving. He no longer dreamed of an imperium of reason, he sought only to preserve what could still be controlled. The Codex Astartes, often seen as a product of strategy, was in truth also a monument to grief, a last attempt to impose meaning on a universe that had proven itself irrational and cruel. For the Ultramarines, the memory of Calth is sacred and profane. They do not speak of it easily. It is a wound wrapped in silence, remembered not with songs but with rededication. Every drill, every recitation of the Codex, every moment of perfect formation is a defiance of that betrayal. A statement that, though they were betrayed, they will never again be caught unprepared. But also, that they will never again be naive. And what of the survivors? The veterans of Calth are not like other Ultramarines. They are quieter, more severe. Their scars are not just physical. They carry the weight of loss, not just of comrades but of ideals. Some whisper that the deepest among them came close to despair. That in the caverns of Calth a few even heard the whispers of the warp and turned away, not from fear but from understanding. Because Calth was not simply a battlefield, it was a revelation. It showed the Ultramarines that the galaxy does not reward nobility, that loyalty can be punished, that law can be laughed at by the gods of madness. And yet, in the face of that revelation, they chose not to become monsters. They chose to become harder, colder, more precise. Calth broke them, but it did not end them. It forged something new, not better, but necessary. And in the shadows of that ruined world, where blue armor clashed with crimson heresy, the Ultramarines learned the most bitter truth of all, that betrayal is not a thing to be feared. It is a certainty to be prepared for. Ultramar is often held aloft as a miracle, a realm of reason in a galaxy gone mad. 30 worlds bound not by fear or superstition, but by law, order, and mutual prosperity. While the wider Imperium drowns in dogma, civil war, and ceaseless decay, Ultramar is said to thrive. It is painted as a utopia, a living echo of the Emperor's original dream, sustained by Guilliman's wisdom and the Ultramarines' eternal vigilance. But for all its gleaming spires and efficient institutions, one must ask, is Ultramar truly an empire of light? Or is it simply another illusion, a well-ordered cage, gilded and adorned, but a cage nonetheless? To understand Ultramar, one must understand its origin. It did not grow organically, like the corrupt hive worlds of the Segmentum Solar. It was architected. Guilliman did not merely conquer, he curated. Every world was assessed, classified, and integrated into a larger system. Bureaucracy replaced tribalism, doctrine replaced myth. Local cultures were permitted, but only if they aligned with the wider vision of compliance. It was not unity, it was assimilation through harmony. The success of Ultramar is undeniable. Its economies function. Its worlds are mostly free from internecine war. Infrastructure is maintained. Populations are educated, fed, and regulated. There are few uprisings, few demonic incursions, and even fewer chaos cults. On paper, it is everything the Imperium should be. But therein lies the problem. Ultramar functions so well that it has become alien in its perfection. It no longer feels like a part of the Imperium. It feels like a preserved specimen, suspended in stasis while the galaxy rots around it. The illusion of Ultramar lies in its control. Freedom exists, but only within acceptable parameters. Religion is permitted, but only that which aligns with imperial truth or later, the ecclesiarchy's dogma. Governance is local, but always subordinate to the tetrarchs of Macragge. Even culture is shaped subtly, with shared symbols, common educational curricula, and omnipresent reverence for Guilliman. The people of Ultramar are not mindless, but they are indoctrinated. Not through fear, but through pride. This pride is the Empire's great strength and its greatest vulnerability. The citizens of Ultramar believe, truly believe, that they are better. that they are the last remnant of the dream. This creates resilience, yes, but also arrogance. When Ultramarines speak of lesser worlds, it is not just military bravado, it is cultural certainty. They view the wider Imperium as broken, decadent, and pitiful. And they are not wrong. But in doing so, they fail to see their own blind spots. For all its wonders, Ultramar is dependent on the Legion that guards it. Without the Ultramarines, the region would not last a century. Its peace is not intrinsic, it is enforced. Not by terror, but by omnipresent power. The Ultramarines are not merely defenders. They are arbiters of policy, shapers of law, and occasionally, silencers of dissent. And while they may act with more civility than other chapters, the end result is the same. The Legion rules, even if it pretends not to. This is the hidden paradox. Ultramar appears to be a decentralized, functional society, but it is, in truth, a soft theocracy. One where Guilliman is not worshipped openly, but revered in every textbook, every civic statue, every child's pledge of allegiance. It is not his sword they fear, it is his disappointment. And in some ways, that is more binding than chains. There are stories, of course. Whispers of suppressed rebellions, quietly erased. Of historians who questioned official records and vanished. Of entire communities relocated when their traditions proved incompatible with compliance. These are not confirmed. They rarely are. But they linger in the corners of Ultramar's perfect cities like shadows that the light cannot fully dispel. Even Guilliman seems to understand the fragility of his empire. Upon his return in the era Indomitus, he expressed not pride, but unease. He saw Ultramar not as a shining beacon, but as a fluke, an oasis surrounded by oceans of horror. And worse, he saw that even his creation had begun to calcify. The ideals of reason had become rituals. The doctrines he wrote as flexible guidelines had ossified into unchallengeable truths. Ultramar had not escaped the decay of the Imperium. It had only delayed it. And yet, despite all this, Ultramar persists. Because for the millions who live there, it is still better. Better than the hive hells of Necromunda. Better than the gladiator pits of Armageddon. Better than the corpse-ruled cults of the Ecclesiarchy. In Ultramar, there is structure. There is hope. There is a future. Even if it is tightly managed. The Empire endures not because it is perfect, but because it is the least broken thing in a shattered galaxy. Its illusion is not false in the way of lies. It is false in the way of dreams, beautiful, comforting, and fragile. A dream that must be protected, even if one day it must be protected from itself. There is a peculiar emptiness that clings to the Ultramarines, a silence where there should be brotherhood. While the other legions roared with the chaotic joy of fraternity, shared pain, and mutual fire, the 13th Legion often stood apart. Not by arrogance nor superiority, but by design. From their earliest days, the Ultramarines were molded to be instruments of Guilliman's vision, and that vision demanded more than courage and might, it demanded obedience. In the crucible of Macragge and the grinding gears of the Codex, something vital was sacrificed, the soul of kinship. For many Astartes, the bond of brotherhood is everything. It is what holds them together when the warp screams in their minds, when their post-human flesh aches with the burden of unending war. In legions like the Luna Wolves, the Salamanders, or the Blood Angels, this bond was tangible, manifest in shared rituals, intimate camaraderie, even laughter between battles. But the Ultramarines were not raised in the warmth of fraternal trust. They were raised in ranks, in silence, in formality, in compliance. This does not mean they lacked loyalty. On the contrary, their loyalty was ironclad, but it was a loyalty directed upward to Guilliman, to the Codex, to Ultramar, not outward to each other. Their oaths were recited with precision, their movements executed with flawless synchronization, but there were no campfire songs, no whispered nicknames, no old tales of foolish deeds shared over armor repairs. Their fellowship was one of structure, not of love. And this structural bond, while strong in peace, proved brittle under betrayal. When the heresy tore the galaxy apart, it wasn't just the Emperor who was struck down. It was the myth of unity. The word-bearer's betrayal at Calth was a shattering blow, not just for the deaths it caused, but for what it revealed. That brothers could lie, that oaths could break. And when that realization hit the Ultramarines, it hit a legion already conditioned to suppress emotion. There was no screaming, no public mourning, only a hardening, a closing off of the soul. In the years that followed, the Ultramarines became increasingly self-contained. They did not reach out to their brother chapters. They did not seek solidarity. Even when forging the Codex, Guilliman emphasized autonomy over unity. Each chapter was to stand alone, its bonds of brotherhood severed in advance. The great legions were split, and with them, the chance to rebuild the camaraderie that had once held the Astartes together. This wasn't oversight, it was intentional. Brotherhood had been deemed a liability, too easily twisted, too easily betrayed. And so the Ultramarines became islands. Polished, orderly islands, but islands all the same. Even within the chapter, formality often replaced intimacy. Senior officers were revered, but rarely known. Battle brothers shared deployments, but not dreams. Deaths were marked, but not mourned. The Codex taught them that they were part of a machine, and machines do not weep when a cog breaks. There are stories, though, moments when the facade cracked, when a sergeant paused too long over the corpse of a fallen brother, when a veteran etched the names of the lost into the inside of his armor, even though the Codex forbade personal inscriptions. When Guilliman himself, returned in the era Indomitus, stood alone in a cathedral and whispered a name, Marius Gage perhaps, or Ventanus, or one of the countless sons who never made it out of Calth. These are the echoes of a brotherhood that was never nurtured, only tolerated. And it is not just internal. The Ultramarines' relationship with other chapters has often been strained. Their successors, the so-called Primogenitors, vary wildly in temperament, from the proud and noble to the zealous and unhinged. But the common thread is distance. Rarely do the Ultramarines embrace them as kin. More often they instruct, they advise, they observe. They are the center, and the others orbit. Not as family, but as satellites. Some say this detachment is strength, that it has allowed the Ultramarines to endure when other chapters fell into fratricide, madness, or treachery. But strength without warmth is brittle. And there is a quiet, unspoken yearning in the Legion's heart, a longing for what was lost. Not glory, not honor, but simple brotherhood. The curse of compliance is not that it breaks men, it is that it prevents them from healing. The Ultramarines do not rage, they do not collapse, they endure. And in that endurance, they bury their sorrow beneath layers of doctrine and duty. They are not cold by nature, they were made to be. Sculpted into perfection, chiseled into instruments, and in the process, left hollow in the places where love might have bloomed. The Ultramarines did not simply leave behind a legacy, they spawned a lineage. More than any other legion, the 13 gave birth to successors. Proud chapters bearing their heraldry, their doctrines, their meticulously codified methods. They are known as the Primogenitors, and their number is vast. Over 60 chapters claim direct descent from Guilliman's sons. To the administratum, this is a triumph of order. To the ecclesiarchy, a sign of divine favor. But to the galaxy at large and to the sons of Guilliman themselves, this proliferation has birthed something darker. Pride, rivalry, and the slow corrosion of the very unity the Codex was meant to preserve. At the heart of this is the Ultramarines' identity. Unlike the shattered remnants of other legions, the 13 emerged from the heresy not only intact, but ascendant. Guilliman's Codex did more than reorganize the Astartes, it ensured that his sons became the model. And so, chapter after chapter was crafted in their image, not just in structure, but in soul. And with each generation, the myth of Ultramar grew, not only as warriors, but as exemplars, as the correct way to be Astartes. This mythos bred reverence, but also arrogance. Many successor chapters see themselves not just as scions of Guilliman, but as purer heirs than even the Ultramarines themselves. The Novamarines, for example, have cultivated a martial tradition so strict, so austere, that they view deviations from the Codex as spiritual failings. The Genesis chapter obsesses over genetic purity, whispering that some later successors may bear faults too deep to be corrected. And the Praetors of Orpheus? They wrap themselves in ceremony and iconography so rich it borders on idolatry. These chapters do not see themselves as cousins. They see themselves as inheritors, each guarding a different facet of Guilliman's truth. And in that belief, competition festers. There are no open wars, not yet, but there are whispered disputes, contested battle honors, strategic disagreements that linger beyond the battlefield. When several primogenitor chapters are deployed together, command must be delicately balanced. Pride bristles beneath the armor. Glory is measured and jealously guarded. The Ultramarines themselves are not immune. Though they often present a face of patience and humility, they are aware of their stature. They are the first sons, the most visible symbol of Guilliman's will. They walk into battle already wearing a myth, and that myth weighs heavy. Other chapters look to them not only for guidance, but for approval, and in that expectation lies resentment. Because the Ultramarines are not perfect, they make mistakes, suffer defeats, falter. But when they do, the galaxy notices, and when others fail, they are measured against the Ultramarines' image. This creates a toxic echo. The Ultramarines feel the pressure to remain ideal. Their successors feel the pressure to live up to them or outshine them. And in both directions, pride takes root. Quiet, festering pride. The kind that doesn't shout or rebel but judges. The kind that does not inspire brotherhood, but breeds distance. Some Primogenitors have drifted so far from the 30's original ethos that they are nearly unrecognizable. The Mortifactors, grim and death-obsessed, revere Guilliman as a prophet of endings. The Sons of Auror delve into relic worship with a fervor that borders on heresy. The Aurora chapter obsesses over armored warfare to the exclusion of all else. And yet all claim to follow the Codex. All claim to be true heirs. This is the paradox. The Codex was meant to unify, but it has enabled endless variations. Each chapter interprets it in their own way, emphasizing different elements, shaping it around their own culture. And in doing so, they drift. Not into rebellion, never that, but into divergence. Cultural, spiritual, strategic. And though Guilliman may tolerate these deviations, he cannot ignore the irony that his gift of order has sown 1,000 seeds of subtle discord. There are still moments of unity. When the Tyranids descended upon Macragge, it was not just the Ultramarines who stood the line, but their successors, and they bled together. There are shared rituals, mutual respect, and occasional joint campaigns. But these are strained by time, by legacy, by expectation. The pride of the Primogenitors is not malicious, it is born of duty. But it casts long shadows. Because pride in the Imperium is a double-edged sword. It fuels valor, yes, but it also blinds. And the Sons of Guilliman, for all their clarity of doctrine, are not immune to blindness. Their pride is not the roaring hubris of the word-bearers, nor the violent ego of the Night Lords. It is quieter, it is procedural. It is the belief that their way is not only right, but the only way. And that belief, if left unchecked, could one day fracture the very lineage it seeks to honor. The galaxy that emerged from the Horus heresy was not merely broken, it was traumatized. The dream of unity had collapsed under the weight of betrayal, and the Imperium stood on the brink of becoming exactly what its enemies had always accused it of being: a fractured empire of paranoia, repression, and blind cruelty. Into this void stepped Robert Guilliman, not as a savior, but as the only one left who could wield the tools of civilization with both skill and vision. But the reforms he enacted, so often praised as salvation, were also walls. High, cold, and unyielding. A fortress of fear, built not to protect, but to prevent. And in its shadow, the Adeptus Astartes became something smaller, safer, and infinitely sadder. The Codex Astartes was only the most visible of these changes. Beyond its tactical doctrines, it imposed a psychological shift. The legions were broken down not only to limit power, but to sever legacy. Guilliman had seen firsthand the dangers of brotherhood unbound, of loyalty stronger than reason. He did not just want to prevent another Horus, he wanted to ensure that no Astartes ever had the capacity to become another Horus. And that meant stripping away everything that had once made them more than soldiers. The reformation of the Imperium's bureaucracy was even more sweeping. Guilliman restructured the administratum into a labyrinthine, self-monitoring machine, intentionally designed to be too vast for any single figure to control. Departments audited departments. Ministries answered to councils. Every decision required multiple signatures, multiple records, multiple layers of compliance. This was not inefficiency, it was design. A system so tangled in its own procedures that no one could rise through it swiftly enough to pose a threat. The Imperium's sclerosis began here, in Guilliman's cold caution. Even the ecclesiarchy, whose explosive growth would later dominate imperial life, was in part an unintended byproduct of Guilliman's reforms. By decentralizing imperial power, by spreading authority thin across many arms, Guilliman created vacuums And in those vacuums, the church thrived. Not because Guilliman desired it, he distrusted faith as a governing principle, but because in curtailing military and political power, he left the realm of belief largely unregulated. Where the sword was leashed, the sermon flourished. There was fear in every reform. Fear of ambition, fear of passion, fear of charisma. Guilliman had come to see inspiration itself as dangerous, the very traits that had made his brothers legends. Their fervor, their vision, their magnetism were, in his eyes, seeds of civil war, and so he buried them. The Astartes became more anonymous, more procedural. The Imperium's leaders became administrators, not visionaries. Even Guilliman himself became remote, writing doctrines instead of leading crusades. He traded fire for function. This fortress of fear was effective. It endured. It prevented another heresy, at least in form, if not in spirit. But it did so by amputating the soul of the Imperium. The great pageants of the Great Crusade gave way to endless paperwork. The living myth of the Emperor became a silent corpse entombed in bureaucracy, and the warriors who had once carried the hopes of mankind on their shoulders became museum pieces, bound by code and hierarchy, their valor diluted by regulation. And within this system, the Ultramarines became exemplars, not because they were the most powerful, but because they were the most compliant. Guilliman's sons became his enforcers, the model by which all others were measured. They did not question, they did not burn with the fire of the past. They followed the script and in doing so, survived. But survival came at the cost of greatness, of intimacy, of myth. There were those who resisted. Dorn fought the Codex and lost a hand. Russ vanished into the stars, refusing to be domesticated. Vulcan wept for the death of his brotherhood. But Guilliman did not flinch. He believed that the age of heroes had ended, that the Imperium could no longer afford greatness, only functionality. In that belief, he was not wrong, but in its execution, he ensured that the Imperium became exactly what he had once hoped to prevent, a cold machine, maintained not by hope, but by fear of collapse. Even Guilliman's personal writings from this era carry the scent of exhaustion. He writes not of glory, but of burden, not of vision, but of duty. He speaks often of containing madness, never of curing it. He became a builder of walls, not bridges, and in time, even he disappeared into the machine he created, his legacy calcifying into dogma, his name invoked by those who had long since forgotten his heart. What remains is a system that endures but does not inspire, a fortress of rules, a prison of policies. It has protected humanity from itself, but it has also ensured that it will never again reach for the stars with the fire of belief. Guilliman feared another fall, and in his caution, he prevented another rise. The heresy broke the Imperium. Guilliman's reforms sealed the fracture, but left the patient paralyzed. The Indomitus Crusade is remembered in brilliant hues, a vast tide of light sweeping across the darkness, bringing the Emperor's justice to a shattered galaxy. Led by a resurrected primarch, fueled by newfound faith and fire, it was hailed as a second Great Crusade, a glorious reclamation, a divine reckoning. But within the grandeur of its banners and the echoes of its thunder lies a truth far more uncomfortable. The Indomitus Crusade was not salvation, it was desperation. Not a crusade of hope, but of damage control. And in its heart, cloaked in propaganda, burns a cold, bitter lie. When Guilliman returned, he did not return to an Imperium he recognized. He found a corpse empire, ossified and blind, bloated by dogma and choking on ritual. He did not weep, he did not scream, he calculated. And in his calculations he saw the truth, that humanity was on the brink, not just militarily, but spiritually. The belief in victory had died, the dream had rotted. What remained was inertia, the slow death of stagnation. The Indomitus Crusade was not launched to reclaim territory. It was launched to reignite myth. From the very beginning, the narrative was engineered. Guilliman allowed the ecclesiarchy to frame him as a divine instrument, a son returned from the grave. He allowed the High Lords to craft parades, to assign symbols, to generate momentum. He allowed the Primaris Marines to be heralded not as tools, but as saviors. The Crusade fleets were named with deliberate grandeur: Torchbearer, Zenith, Sanctus Halo, each evoking prophecy and divine fire. It was not enough to win battles. They had to win the story. Because the war was not going well. The Imperium Nihilus, the The dark half of the galaxy, cut off by the Cicatrix Maledictum, remained largely unreachable. Many of the liberated worlds were only partially secured, their surface pacified while their underworlds festered with heresy. In some sectors, the new Primaris reinforcements were resented, viewed as artificial warriors, as symbols of an imperium that had abandoned its old sons. There were clashes, quiet ones, never recorded officially, between old chapters and their new Primaris kin, between the past and the future. Worse, the Crusade's logistics were unsustainable. Guilliman knew this. He saw the flaw. The Imperium had grown too vast, too starved, too fragmented. Supply lines stretched to absurdity. Worlds were retaken, then lost again within months. Entire systems pledged loyalty, then vanished into warp storms. Guilliman moved like a man bailing water from a sinking ship, not to save it all, but to keep the illusion afloat long enough to prevent mass despair. Even the Primaris themselves were part of the lie. Created in secret by Call over 10,000 years, they were deployed as a panacea, better, stronger, more stable. But they lacked history. They lacked soul. They were born into a war they did not understand, under a father they had never known. Their loyalty was forged in laboratories and indoctrination vaults, not in the fires of the Crusade or the blood of Istvan. And for many of them, the war was not a calling. It was a protocol. Guilliman saw this too, and he pressed on, because he had no choice. The lie had to continue, because the truth, that the Imperium was dying, and had been dying for millennia, was too dangerous to speak. The people needed a crusade, the chapters needed a purpose, the galaxy needed a symbol, and so he gave them one, himself. He stood at the head of the crusade, not as Guilliman the pragmatist, but as Guilliman the savior. He wore the trappings of legend. He allowed himself to be worshipped, and in doing so, he sacrificed the very principles he had once held dear. The truth became secondary. Efficiency became theater. War became a story, one that had to be believed. And it worked, in part. Worlds rallied, systems were reconnected, tyrannid tendrils were burned away, chaos cults were crushed. The Crusade did reclaim territory, did reignite faith. But at what cost? The Imperium now believes it is winning, that the return of the Primarch means destiny is real, that victory is ordained. But Guilliman knows better. He knows that the true enemy is not the Xenos or the heretic, it is the entropy of a dying civilization. The Indomitus Crusade was not a second dawn. It was a delaying action, a magnificent, sprawling, beautifully orchestrated illusion, one that Guilliman maintains not out of vanity, but necessity. Because if the lie falls, so does everything. Reboot Guilliman's return was not a resurrection, it was a reckoning. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had whispered his name in reverence, stamped his doctrines into stone, and built cathedrals upon the skeletons of his ideas. They had made him a symbol, a paragon, a saint of order in a galaxy gone mad. But when he opened his eyes and looked upon the Imperium he had helped forge, what he saw was not triumph, it was ruin. And in that moment, the legend bled, and the demigod became a man once more, a man faced with a nightmare that bore his name. The awakening of Guilliman was a miracle engineered in shadows, the convergence of Archmagos Belisarius' calls forbidden genius, Eldar sorcery, and divine accident. It was not planned by the High Lords, it was not authorized by the ecclesiarchy. And when he rose from the brink of death, healed by Xeno's magic and the defiance of a dying goddess, Guilliman returned not to the Imperium of his father, but to a prison of his own legacy. What he found was horrifying. The imperial truth, once the foundation of secular unity, had been replaced by the ecclesiarchy's dogma, a galaxy of temples, litanies, and flame. The emperor himself had become a god, his image stamped onto every surface, his name invoked in every breath. The bureaucracies Guilliman had designed to prevent tyranny had calcified into paralyzing institutions, where orders took decades to move between offices, and starvation was logged in triplicate. The Astartes, his sons, had become fractured shadows of the legions he once led. Some zealots, some hollow shells, many barely more than branded warbands. And worst of all, humanity had accepted this. The people of the Imperium did not cry out for reform. They did not beg for light. They knelt, they worshipped. They rejoiced at Guilliman's return, not because he was their leader, but because they believed he was divine. To them, he was not a builder of order. He was a second coming, a holy sword, a sign that the end times had been delayed. And in this suffocating reverence, Guilliman found no comfort. only sorrow. He tried, of course. He took command. He reorganized what he could. He launched the Indomitus Crusade. But even as he moved across the stars, he knew he was no longer leading a civilization. He was guiding a corpse with just enough life left to twitch and convulse. The reforms he attempted were resisted not by traitors, but by inertia. The administratum refused to change. The ecclesiarchy countered every move with sermons. The Astartes, fractured and proud, followed but did not listen. In private, Guilliman is said to rage, not with the fire of Angron or the madness of Kurz, but with quiet fury, the kind that eats from within. He writes furiously, updating the Codex, issuing missives, shaping new doctrines, but he no longer believes these will save the Imperium. They are not blueprints for salvation, they are emergency protocols. Guilliman is not rebuilding, he is triaging. And yet for all his pain, he plays the role. He wears the armor of faith. He allows the people to believe. Because even in his bitterness, he understands this truth. The Imperium no longer survives on truth. It survives on myth, on fire and ritual and fear. The Emperor is not a man to them, he is the God Emperor. And Guilliman, whether he likes it or not, is now part of that religion. A living saint of order, a demigod in ceramite. This duality haunts him. He speaks to the Emperor but receives no reply. He walks through cathedrals built in his father's name and feels only emptiness. He commands armies but questions whether victory even matters anymore. He is surrounded by billions who would die for him, and yet he is alone, utterly, completely alone. And still he fights, not because he believes he can win, but because he refuses to surrender. He marches not toward victory, but defiance, against entropy, against the madness of chaos, against the slow, grinding death of a species that once dreamed of stars. Guilliman knows he cannot restore the dream, but he will not let it vanish without resistance. He is not the savior the Imperium believes him to be. He is not a god. He is a man, exhausted, embittered, and burning with the last embers of duty. And in that, he is more heroic than any legend. Because legends do not suffer. But Guilliman does, and he endures. For all the legends, all the doctrine, all the structure and precision, the truth that lies at the heart of the Ultramarines is profoundly, painfully simple. They are human, not in the flesh, that was stripped from them in the gene forges of Mars, not in their strength, which far exceeds anything born of mortal blood, but in their hearts, in their doubts, in the quiet griefs they never voice. Beneath the shining armor and flawless formations, the Ultramarines are not paragons. They are survivors of a dream long dead, still walking its echo with purpose and pain. They are not what they appear. The Imperium sees them as models, the Astartes perfected. Calm, dutiful, obedient. But this image is a mask, and behind it lives a soul bruised by 10,000 years of unending war and impossible expectation. They were raised to be symbols, forged in the vision of a father who believed that order could save mankind. But order cannot bind the heart. And in the silence of their chapels, in the darkness of their barracks, the Ultramarines carry regrets too heavy for words. Some remember Calth, not just the fire and betrayal, but the moment when trust died. Others remember comrades lost to the creeping shadow of chaos, or to bureaucratic indifference, or to the simple cruelty of being deemed inefficient in a world that values precision above all else. The Codex taught them how to fight, how to organize, how to endure, but it never taught them how to mourn. And so they don't. Not openly. They recite the litanies, they follow the forms, but inside there is ache. They wonder what it means to be brothers when everything is reduced to protocol. They wonder if the dream of Ultramar, clean and perfect and stable, was ever real, or if it was just another imperial illusion. They wonder what their father would say now if he could see them, hollow-eyed and dutiful, still playing their part in a theater that has long since collapsed. And still, they fight. Not out of blind loyalty, not even out of faith, but because they know that if they do not, there will be no one left to carry the flame. They are not heroes because they are flawless. They are heroes because they bleed and still rise, because they know the price of failure, because they have tasted despair and kept marching. Even Guilliman, returned and transformed, has not brought peace to their hearts. His presence is a reminder of everything they lost, of the gulf between what was promised and what was delivered. He is revered, yes, obeyed without question, But there are nights when some Ultramarines stare up at the stars and ask themselves if their father still sees them as sons, or simply as tools, if he ever truly did. The soul of the Ultramarines is not in their victories. It is not in the Codex. It is not in the perfection of their formations or the gleam of their armor. It is in the small things. The way a veteran lays a hand on the shoulder of a neophyte before battle. The way they pause for a moment too long before igniting the funeral pyres. The way they carry banners stained with the blood of brothers whose names are no longer remembered. It is in the silence between orders, in the moments when they are just men in blue armor, looking at a galaxy that has bled them dry. They are human after all. Not in flesh, not in blood, but in heart, and that heart still beats, even beneath 10,000 years of duty. It beats for a dream long dead, for a future they may never see. For each other. And maybe that's the most sacred thing left in the Imperium. If you've made it this far, brother or sister of the Grimdark, thank you. If you felt something here, rage, awe, sorrow, admiration, then the soul of this legion still speaks. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten truths of the 41st millennium. The Imperium may be built on silence, but we are here to remember.